Jay, thank you very much indeed. After an introduction of that kind, in which I must confess I didn't remotely recognise myself, I was reminded of Lyndon Johnson's observations after he was introduced very generously at a dinner in Houston in 1963, and he turned to his audience and said something like the following: "Thank you very much. I just wish that my mother and my father could have been here to hear it, because my mother would have believed it and my father would have enjoyed it." So Jay, thank you very much indeed. I did indeed enjoy it, but I didn't entirely believe it. Welcome to you all. A very warm welcome to Oxford, a warm welcome to St Anne's, a special institution which has transformed, and I mean transformed, so many lives of students and faculty over the years, which enjoys an extraordinarily high commitment from its members, including its remarkable staff in the kitchen and buttery and bursary, the cleaning staff, maintenance staff, right across the college. It's a remarkable community, and I'm indebted to it and its people. So a very warm welcome to you all. Our being here tonight is testimony to the energy and commitment of the leader of the Kinder Institute and to the supporters of the Kinder Institute. And I would like to take this opportunity of thanking very warmly indeed Jay Sexton, who is bringing the qualities of academic leadership to the University of Missouri that he brought to Oxford, and to thank all those supporters of Jay as a person, as an academic, as a leader, and of the Kinder Institute more generally, at a time when the funding of state universities in the United States is deplorably weaker than it should be, and weaker than America needs it to be. So thank you all very much indeed for all that you do and make possible. And a very warm welcome back to Oxford, to Jay and to Julie. I must say, I think two of Oxford's most brilliant exports to the United States in recent years, and Missouri's gain has, if I may enter a personal note, most assuredly been our loss. We miss them greatly, and it's a joy to have them back among us this evening. And a very warm welcome too to all of those from Missouri for whom this is their first visit to Oxford. I have myself often visited Independence, Missouri, in the course of working at the Truman Library, and have only ever found huge generosity on the part of the staff of that remarkable institution, great warmth, and immense professional competence. I want to talk this evening not about an academic subject, and certainly not in an academic way. Jay gently suggested, Jay does sometimes gently suggest, that perhaps an academic talk after dinner, especially one as fine as we've enjoyed this evening, would be inappropriate. So I said I would just make some remarks, and it seemed to both of us, I think, that it might be appropriate to think a little about the special relationship between the United States and the United Kingdom in the context of someone who was born at a house which I believe many, if not all of you, visited today at Blenheim, namely Winston Spencer Churchill. So I thought I'd do that. I've recently visited the house not in which Churchill was born, but the house that he bought was scarcely ever able to afford, but in which he lived for almost all of his active political life, Chartwell in Kent. You will not, on this visit, I imagine, have time to visit Chartwell. It's open to the public, it's owned by the National Trust, But I strongly recommend that you visit it, so that's an implicit invitation to return, which I hope you will. You should visit Chartwell. And if you visit it, you will have to contend with rather too many other visitors spilling out of cars and buses, each of them trying to get a sense of the life and world of Britain's greatest 20th century wartime Prime Minister. One of the banes of visiting English country houses open to the public, especially those which were occupied by people of genuine fame and weight, such as Churchill was, is coping with other people who also very irritatingly think it's a good idea to visit English country houses lived in by great people. So when you go, you should expect to find Chartwell rather too busy. Busy with people trying to discern something of Churchill's life and purpose. Let me say something about the house and Churchill's place in it. Chartwell sits in what is quite magnificent Kent countryside. The house, alas, is not magnificent, and it is certainly not an adornment to that countryside. It is an unattractive set of dark red brick blocks. They seem to scowl, as Churchill himself occasionally scowled, at the sheer loveliness of the ponds and woods in the estate before it, and the English meadows beyond. But I want to urge you not to let the house's external ugliness put you off. For a study of what is within the house and what can be seen from the house tell us a lot about Churchill. And Churchill, out of office in particular, spent a great deal of time at Chartwell, as did almost all members of the English, indeed British, political elite, because anybody who was anybody, and quite a lot of people who were nobody in particular, came to see him there. They came to see him, to talk with him, more often to listen to him, and to try to see what he saw of the world from Chartwell's windows. It is indeed a house of windows onto the county of Kent, onto England beyond, the English Channel and continental Europe beyond it, the area of the world that concerned him so centrally in his adult life. It's also a house of other windows, which I find even more interesting and which I would suggest when you do go to Chartwell, as I hope you will, you might too find cause for reflection. Because it is a house of paintings, Churchill's paintings mostly, windows, some of them, into Churchill's soul, windows, other of them, onto the world that he saw beyond Chartwell, beyond England. I think in particular of a dark portrait, literally dark, nearly black portrait, painted in 1915, and the date is significant, of Winston Churchill, paintbrush in hand, emerging from that dark, eyes downcast, conveying, as it seems to me, his lifelong struggle with depression and with the human cost of total war, the emotional toll of which upon him was very considerable. Let us now lift our eyes from Chartwell, from the domesticity of his life as a painter, as a gardener, and even as a bricklayer. He became an expert bricklayer in helping win the estate in that place. Let's lift our eyes from the domesticity of that house to Churchill's understanding of Anglo-American relations and his place in those relations. I'm not going to present Churchill as someone in whose political life we find solutions to the problems of 2018, whether in the United States or in the United Kingdom, the European Union, or any of the other great democracies of the world. But I do want to suggest this evening that there are important qualities in his political life that resonate with me, and I'm not a scholar of Churchill, nor of British politics, so I speak out of very deep ignorance, a common condition in my case. Qualities in his political life that resonate with me and whose importance I think endures. I see Churchill as a British figure, most obviously, but I see him also as an American figure, unquestionably as an international figure, and also, and this is the focus that I wish to give it this evening, also as a transatlantic figure. He was, after all, partly American. His mother was born in Brooklyn, which those of my friends who live there tell me is more American than anywhere else in the United States. He himself used to refer to himself occasionally as half American and wholly British. He was 1/64th Seneca, a fact of which he was appropriately proud. He was also, and this is so unusual among British politicians of the 20th century, he was also acutely sensitive to American perspectives upon the transatlantic relationship and upon the world of democracies. To take an example, he pressed repeatedly, creatively, for an opportunity in 1940 and 41 to explain to the American people why Britain was fighting fascism, and managed to arrange for President Ballantyne at the University of Rochester to give him an honorary degree so that he might do that explaining. Churchill's acceptance speech at the University of Rochester in 1941 shows us his understanding of the American predicament, but his confidence that predicament will be overcome. All the forces of good will confront, he said, the forces of bad. That was a problem, of course, which Germany, with uncharacteristic charity, solved for Churchill and for Roosevelt by declaring war upon the United States. And less than 3 weeks later, Churchill spoke to a joint session of Congress, just 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor. And that speech, available, of course, as everything else is, on YouTube, that speech shows Churchill's astonishing capacity for empathizing with others with whom he needs to do business, in this case with congressional and executive leaders of the United States. Here's what he said. The fact that my American forebears have for so many generations played their part in the life of the United States, and that here I am, an Englishman, welcomed in your midst, makes this experience one of the most moving and thrilling in my life. I cannot help reflecting that if my father had been American and my mother British, instead of the other way around, I might have got here on my own. In that case, this would not have been the first time you in the House of Representatives and the Senate would have heard my voice. In that case, I should not have needed any invitation. But if I had, it is hardly likely that it would have been unanimous. So perhaps things are better as they are. How to get people on your side. It's a speech which speaks to Churchill's empathy, to his wit, to his imagination, and to his comic timing. He had the House and the Senate in the palm of his hand. That speech showed, I think, Churchill's sensitivity to America's journey to greatness in the world. And that journey which America took in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries was one that Churchill accepted and admired. He was himself a student of American history, and a student in particular of the American Civil War, and he knew where his sympathies lay in that war. He recalled later in life reading Punch, which for, I guess, probably the great majority of the members of the University of Missouri who are here this evening, too young to know that Punch was an occasionally serious British weekly magazine, sadly no longer with us. Churchill recalled reading it at the age of 6 and coming across a cartoon for which Punch was famous. And he was struck in this cartoon by the similarities between the cruelties imposed upon him at his brutal English school and those systematically imposed upon African Americans in the antebellum South. Churchill recalled, Mr. Punch was against the South, and we had a picture in the magazine of a fierce young woman, Miss Carolina, who was about to whip a naked slave with a kind of scourge which, not myself yet being removed from such possibilities, I regarded as undoubtedly severe. I was all for the slave. His interest in American history flourished. At the age of 13, on his 13th birthday, he asked his mother for a copy of Grant's personal memoirs of the Civil War. In later life, Churchill had a conventional, if at least to me unpersuasive, view of Grant's conduct of war in the Western theatre, and an unconventional but similarly unpersuasive view of McClellan's failure to conduct any kind of war at all in the Eastern theatre. But these threads in Churchill's life and interest come together in Churchill's mind. He formed his views early about America, and those views really changed little. To put Churchill's lifelong view negatively, he was convinced, I think beyond doubt, that the United States was a country with which Britain should not go to war. That proposition may not seem very remarkable in 2018, but in 1895, the year of Churchill's first visit to the United States, Britain and the United States were quarrelling over the boundary between Venezuela and British Guiana. Churchill brooded on the possibility upon his return home. In his maiden speech in the House of Commons, he referred to the incident. "Evil will be the day," he said. "Dark would be the counsellors when we embarked on that most foolish, futile, and fatal of all wars, war with the United States." I think I'd put matters a little more positively. Churchill thought an Anglo-American alliance essential for British and for American security. In the days before air travel, Churchill was a remarkably frequent visitor to America. He made, by my count, 16 visits in total, that first in 1895 and the last in 1961. The first president whom he met was McKinley. He also met Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. This was a person who, when he went to the United States, always met with people at the top of political and commercial life. America impressed him deeply. So did Americans as individuals and as groups, especially in war. He was in World War I so powerfully struck that 26,000 Americans should have volunteered to fight in the Allied armies before America's formal entry into the war. Churchill himself commanded a battalion in the trenches. A friend of his, Lieutenant Harvey Butters, killed in the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Churchill wrote of him in his obituary in The Observer, the London newspaper. He did not come all the way from San Francisco only out of affection for the ancient home of his forebears or in a spirit of new adventure. He was in sentiment a thorough American, but he had a very clear and firm conception of the issues that are at stake in this struggle. In his book on World War I, The World Crisis, Churchill explained to his British readers, note this ambassadorial role, explaining Britain to Americans and explaining America to Britons. He explained to his British readers the nature of American sentiment, that if he had had an American father, he too might have been reluctant to join the struggle against Germany. With a roar of slowly gathered pent-up wrath, he wrote, the American nation sprang to arms. Martin Gilbert, Churchill's extraordinary biographer, over 8 volumes, accepts that there was British resentment at America's late entry, but holds that Churchill regarded the United States nonetheless as our cousins, our brothers, the great republic of the United States. In short, Churchill thought 100 years ago this year that the United States was Britain's indispensable ally and vice versa. On the 4th of July 1918, just after he had himself returned from the Western Front, Churchill said that he had experienced emotions that words cannot describe. The only recompense Britain seeks from the American people is the supreme reconciliation of Britain and the United States. If our two armies and two nations work well together to secure the victory, Britain and the United States may yet act permanently together. So we see the threads, even at an early point, around the time of the First World War, of a commitment to an Atlantic alliance and to collective security. And that commitment survived his disappointment, to put it mildly, that the League of Nations, which was an American idea, was an institution which the United States did not itself join. Churchill was convinced that, disappointments notwithstanding, the watchword in building a relationship with the United States should be patience. In a romantic essay he had written as a young man, "I want to be Prime Minister, to be in daily communication with the President of the United States. There is nothing we could not do together." The point is, he thought the United States was undefeatable, and by unacknowledged implication, I think, he recognized that Britain was declining. His commitment to securing an alliance with the United States after Britain found itself alone in 1939 was complete, and it was, as I've indicated, eventually secured, albeit at the price of Britain being the junior partner in a relationship that Churchill declared and indeed thought special. Now let me move from Churchill and America to taking 5 themes from Churchill's life which seem to me still of direct relevance for our politics today. The first thing to be said is that Churchill was a parliamentarian, and a very great parliamentarian. He himself trusted in representative democracy. He accommodated himself broadly to the great changes in British political life in the first half of the 20th century, the emancipation of women, the partial democratization of Britain's politics, the welfare state. He accommodated himself to those changes that Parliament wrought rather better than some of his Conservative Party, indeed some of his Labour Party colleagues themselves did. Parliament was his chosen theatre, a space within which his ambition and purpose played out. If anywhere was his natural home other than Chartwell, the House of Commons was it. Second, he was a reader. Modern-day politicians, please take note. He was a reader, he was a writer, albeit a rather romantic writer of history, and a formidable orator. He was, I think, as at home in the House of Commons as in prepared speeches before great audiences. I can think of very few public figures so accomplished at judging the measure of variant audiences and variant contingencies in the House of Commons as he. Nor can I think of anyone who adjusted to speaking in other legislatures with the ease that he did. Remember that speech that I mentioned a little earlier on the 26th of December 1941, achieving near instant mastery of a joint session of Congress. It's no small matter. But 4 days later, in a speech much less well remembered in the United States, though very well remembered in Canada, Churchill addressed the Canadian House of Commons in Ottawa. In that speech, he referred to the rather foolish forecast of a French general that following Britain's experience at Dunkirk in 1940, Britain would soon be cast before the Nazi invader as a chicken having its neck wrung. Churchill's response in Ottawa, and here, if I may, using the example of Gareth Davis this afternoon, who gave himself permission to impersonate Lyndon Johnson well, I shall now attempt to impersonate Winston Churchill badly. Churchill's response in Ottawa to that forecast that Britain would have its neck wrung as a chicken simply said, "Some chicken, some neck." Churchill's speeches had rhetorical power. They had comic timing, and they had that elusive capacity to inspire. He wrote all of them. Martin Gilbert's paper base for his huge biography was, and Martin Gilbert had it weighed, 15.5 tons. Churchill's capacity to move by words moves us still. How well would he have adjusted to Twitter? Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. 73 characters. Third, Churchill was a strategic thinker. I speak on this side about matters on this side of the Atlantic and on this side of the English Channel. Strategy among politicians is a lost art in 2018. I cannot bring to mind a single member of the front bench, either of the governing party or of the opposition, who has any discernible capacity to think strategically, nor any propensity to do so, save on those occasions when they make themselves look thoroughly foolish. Churchill was a strategic thinker, as it must be said were many of his contemporaries. But unlike many of those contemporaries, he was also a prescient strategic thinker. Very few saw as clearly as Churchill did in the 1930s the threat of fascism. None, I think, was braver, none more energetic in confronting that threat. Churchill had both the propensity and the capacity to think in large geopolitical terms. During and immediately after the war that he had himself anticipated and forecast, strategic vision showed again in his recognizing, frankly, earlier either than Franklin Roosevelt or President Truman, the potency of the potential Soviet threat. Churchill was key to the Truman Doctrine's emergence and its execution. He thought on a large scale, he painted on the broadest canvas, and persuaded others of his vision, a strategist first and last. That capacity, his capacity and propensity to persuade, to argue, and to inspire, points to the fourth quality, that of his leadership. A much overused term in my view. I think of Churchill's leadership, however, as genuine, as encompassing his sense of purpose, his unquenchable resolution, his commitment to grounded democratic values in representative democracy as a process and as a value, and I think of it too expressed in a confidence in his own judgment that usually did not degenerate into arrogance, as it sometimes does in democratic politicians. I think of it too expressed in his learning from history, in his sheer courage in attempting the seemingly impossible, and I underline this point, his integrity. My fifth point is to point in particular to his understanding that in being a member of Parliament and in exercising his powers as a Minister of the Crown and as Prime Minister, Winston Churchill knew something that too many politicians forget, that he exercised a public trust. These dimensions of leadership resonate not just with respect to matters of war and defence, but to questions of fundamental import to all democracies, not least in 2018, questions of fairness, of equality, and of power. As I listened last week to Mark Zuckerberg's attempt to explain Facebook's behavior in recent years, I reflected briefly upon the irony of this master of modern communication being so very bad at communicating to his customers. But I listened to him too and reflected upon Churchill's suspicion of monopolies, oligopolies, and concentrated power, something that he shared with Theodore Roosevelt. I am, he once observed, opposed thoroughly to merchant princes and combinations. To be poor but independent is worth something as a motto. So I think it is. So Churchill still, it seems to me, for these 5 reasons, speaks to us 53 years after his death. The Great Republic, as Churchill referred to the United States, and as I'm pleased to refer to it myself this evening, and our own parliamentary democracy would, I think, both benefit enormously from a reinvigoration of our great legislative bodies. The United States Congress today is not, I think, performing the role remotely, the role not only that the framers had in mind for it, it's not remotely performing the role that it did so reliably between, let us say, 1945 and 1975. I think the same is true, alas, of the House of Commons. So I think our leaders would do well to start by doing what Churchill did, but which few now do, which is to read, not least about the history of the institutions of which they are now part, to read in general, to read books in particular, and to read political history, institutional history perhaps most of all. Not because history offers simple answers to 21st century questions or to any other sort of questions, but because history prompts itself relevant questions that illuminate the complexities of deciding between options, all of which, for politicians and for us, are usually unattractive. Current generations of political leaders should never forget, I think, that in exercising lawful authority, they do indeed exercise a public trust, which in a law-governed democracy is infinitely precious. Allow me a 6th reason with which I shall conclude. Churchill thought the United States, as I've said, the indispensable ally of the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom the indispensable ally of the United States. What he thought about the politics of the first half of the last century is not what he might have thought about the politics of the first half of this, had he lived today rather than then. But the reasons for representative democracies acting collectively to boost their welfare, as with free trade regimes, and to ensure their security, as with resolute military alliances such as NATO, those reasons persist. What representative democracies share matters supremely and is altogether more important than that which divides them. Surely Churchill would share that view too. He did then, I'm sure he would now. As I've reflected, as I often have, being once rather more closely involved in these questions than I've been in recent years, as I've reflected upon Russia's behaviour in the course of the last 10 to 12 years, culminating this month in the use by Russian agents of Russian chemical weapons on a British street against British citizens, and in the steadfast international response to that deplorable act, my conviction remains that the alliance between Britain and the United States will endure because it is in the interests of both of our nations and of their allies that it should and that it must. In his final words to his cabinet in 1955, on the eve of his retirement as Prime Minister, Winston Churchill gave his colleagues this following advice: never be separated from the Americans. Winston Churchill was key to the creation of the 20th century relationships between our countries and our peoples, which we see splendidly and happily arrayed here this evening in our own example. His qualities remain key to the nurturing of those relationships in the 21st century, and I think of those relationships every time, as I now do, since I often travel between here and Cambridge, when I pass the vast American military cemetery just outside that great university city. That cemetery, given most generously to the American people by the University of Cambridge after the last war, contains the mortal remains of 300,812 American servicemen. We sit here this evening and enjoy the dinner that we have and the conversations that we have had because of what they and their comrades in the Allied forces once did together. That is a special achievement of a very special relationship. Thank you very much indeed.